Pilgrims have poured into various Indian temple towns for centuries. Madurai has long been a favorite destination for spiritual travelers. The city finds a mention in the Sangam literature of Tamil Nadu, our only source for the ancient times in southern India. Life in the town is dominated by the massive Meenakshi temple and is a mix of religion and commerce. Thousands of pilgrims make the journey to Madurai every year, carrying with them their hopes, their fears, and their petitions to the gods.
இங்க வந்து கேக்குற வரங்கள் கிடைக்கும் நிச்சயம் நம்பிக்கை உண்டு. நாங்க இதே மாதிரி நிறைய வருஷங்கள் anniversary வண்டி கான்செப்ட் கொண்டாடணும் அப்படி நினைச்சிருக்கேன் நான்.
Among the many legends of pilgrimage that dot Indian history, the story of one early traveller is particularly intriguing. The Puranas tell us that the sage Agastya commanded the tall Vindhya mountains to lie flat and to allow him to cross over to the south. There he defeated demons and even drank up the ocean. This tale perhaps reflects the slow but steady Brahmin penetration of the southern peninsula, possibly by members of the Agastya Gotra. Over the centuries, people migrated in large numbers from the north to the peninsula. Records of the time illustrate the presence of both cultures. The earlier texts written by the northern settlers were in Sanskrit and Prakrit, but the local Tamil script soon made an appearance. This overlapping of cultures and the mingling of the so-called Aryans and the Dravidians added spice to Indian history. Spices which grew abundantly in parts of southern India attracted a variety of foreign traders to the region. Among these early traders were the Romans, who set up a trading post at Arikamedu near today's Pondicherry. Fragments of Roman pottery found here testify to the fact that in Europe all roads may well have led to Rome, but the sea lanes led from Rome to Tamil Nadu. An overland traveller, the Chinese scholar Huan-Sang, who came to India in the 8th century, made an interesting observation. He noted that the farther south he went, the less cultivated land he saw. The fact is that the land is less productive in the south than in the north. The peninsula lacks the vast fertile plains of the north, and hence large kingdoms based on agriculture, like that of the Mauryas, could not develop here. Instead, smaller kingdoms arose. Each of them was fiercely independent and determined to protect its identity. Regional loyalties prevailed, and southern India saw many kingdoms flourish. Even as the centralized and mighty Mauryan Empire faded in the north, the sun rose over the kingdom of the Pallavas in the south. Indian and European historians tend to differ on the origin of the Pallavas in southern India.
Westerners have had this tendency of ascribing Western influences or non-Indian influences to almost everything which is grand and great in Indian history. Thus, for instance, the Pallava temples in Mahabalipuram and elsewhere were ascribed by Westerners to a foreign dynasty. The Pallavas were thought to be Pahlavis, Iranian by descent. If they could not be Iranian, at least they must be North Indian, because they use Puranic motifs. The fact is that the Pallavas were probably indigenous as the other rulers of Tamil Nadu, and created their empire on a system of alliances, a complex system of alliances based on the local political economy. And if they used Puranic symbols or adopted Puranic gods as their deities, it was only in order to get legitimacy in the newly important Brahmanical order which was coming over Tamil Nadu.
One of the earlier records tells us that a Pallava king is noted for having distributed large quantities of gold among his subjects, and even 1,000 plows. This clearly suggests that the early Pallavas encouraged the clearing and settling of new land. The kings must have realized that the land could be used more productively for growing crops rather than for grazing herds. With increased produce, the king could collect more taxes. Out of this accumulated wealth, some of the enduring monuments of southern India arose. These famous rock-cut temples at Mahabalipuram were built in the early 7th century during the reign of King Mahendravarman I. Mahendravarman belonged to the later group of Pallavas and was responsible for the growing political strength of the dynasty. His reign ensured the Pallavas a place in history as the chief patrons of Tamil culture. On the other side of the peninsula, the Cholas ruled over what is now Kerala. From the 8th century onwards, the Malabar coast attracted a new set of traders from the west, the Arabs. Unlike the Romans, the Arab traders chose to settle along the Malabar coast. They were welcomed and left free to practice their religion. They, for their part, did not try to convert others to Islam and thus blended smoothly with the local society. Their major concern remained trade. The Arabs introduced their own style of shipbuilding. The traditional skill of dhow making has been inherited by their descendants, the Malabar Muslims, or Mappilas as they are known. Christianity was brought to the western coast of South India by one of Christ's disciples shortly after the crucifixion. Doubting Thomas, so called because he had to touch Christ's wounds before he could believe in the resurrection, is supposed to have landed at this place in Kerala. The church erected to mark the spot is a replica of the Vatican. Ironically, it was the Syrian Orthodox Church rather than Roman Catholicism, which came to flourish in Kerala. There are many legends about St. Thomas that cloud the historical truth. He is thought to have been martyred at this spot on the east coast, on the outskirts of Madras. Whether myth or reality, this story tells us that people did travel across the peninsula, probably in the course of trade. Trade, especially in spices, had always attracted the Jews, and their roots in Cochin go back for centuries. Generations lived and died here, though few remain today. The focal point of the community is still the place of worship, the synagogue. But India has not been without its influence. The Hebrew Star of David finds itself in unexpected company in Jewtown, cheek by jowl with the Hindu swastika. Perhaps appropriate in a town that generated so much masala. Another foreign ingredient is detectable on the waterfront. These fishing nets seem the very image of Cochin, but they are not in fact a local innovation. They were probably introduced by traders from China. New technology and new ideas were washed in along with trade and commerce. The Madras coastline today is dotted with small catamarans, which provide the local fishermen with a modest livelihood. But in the heyday of the southern kingdoms, these seas were ruled by powerful navies. These sought to control the trade routes, which led the way to immense wealth. Both sea and land therefore bolstered the power of these kingdoms. However, this power was never centralized. It was characterized by feudalism.
There has been much debate on the nature of feudalism in India in general and of feudalism in South India in particular. Kosambi posited that in fact there were two types of feudalisms. There was feudalism from above and feudalism from below. Feudalism from above meant that there was a king who established a hierarchical order of nobles or feudatories under him. By feudalism from below, Kosambi meant that the king was just one among the feudal lords, that this hierarchical order arose on the basis of the feudatories themselves. In any event, what is clear is that the more or less even power of the feudal lords in South India in particular, but India in general, meant that there was a great deal of seesawing. At one point one dynasty came up, at another different dynasty.
This seesawing of dynasties is dramatically shown by the varying fortunes of the Pallavas and their rivals, the Cholas. The Thanjavur temple complex, built by the Cholas, gives evidence that theirs was among the greatest of the southern Indian dynasties. The Cholas had been virtually submerged by the Pallavas for several centuries. They rose again in the 10th century and their powers soared. Today, the atmosphere in the great Thanjavur temple is sleepy. This is a far cry from the time when the king himself lived inside the fortified temple and was guarded by his troops and war elephants. At the height of the kingdom's glory, the courtyards reverberated with the footsteps of soldiers rather than of pilgrims. Now the resident elephant is adored rather than feared, as it collects offerings for its own upkeep as well as that of its keeper. These wall inscriptions record the offerings of pilgrims from a bygone age. The seemingly endless list of donors points to the flourishing economy of the Chola Empire. Harnessing of water for crop irrigation was one way in which the Cholas increased their wealth. One of their innovations was to construct this dam on the Kaveri river. Later rulers like the British built on their foundations, and the Kaveri became the lifeline of southern India. The placidity of the river belies the passions that its waters inflame even today in this relatively arid zone of India. The Cholas also expanded their domain by sea. They conquered northern Sri Lanka and sent out great naval expeditions. The Cholas, like the Pallavas before them, used their navy not merely as an instrument of war, but as a tool to assert their dominance over trade. This was especially lucrative in the Southeast Asian region, where three major kingdoms were in close contact with India. These were Sri Vijaya, Kambuja, and Champa. The central part of the Chola Empire was the region around Kanchi and Thanjavur. They introduced some remarkable administrative measures. A system of village and district councils gave people a sense of participation, although it was not truly democratic. The political stability and freedom from attack greatly encouraged Tamil culture. Temples like this one at Tiruchirappalli form the heart of this organic kingdom, which thrived on internal and external trade. Back on the west coast, the foreign traders, in particular the Arabs, began to take over the initiative in the trade with the West. Indian traders were no longer carriers of goods themselves, but mere suppliers to the Arabs. Thus, Indian contacts with the West became indirect. The commodities that were still coveted the most were spices. The spice trade was lucrative enough to last over 1,000 years, well into the medieval period. Its profits gave an impetus to the growth of other major kingdoms in southern India, such as the Bahamanis. The Fort of Golconda was the base of one of the most powerful of the Bahamani kingdoms. This signalling portico was an ingenious way of communicating across the fort. Such early warning devices were vital in the perennial power struggles that were played out in those days. The Bahmanis frustrated the ambitions of the Delhi Sultans, who were trying to expand southwards. Ultimately, they resisted the expansion of the great Mughal Empire itself. The favourite enemy of the Bahmanis, however, was the Vijayanagar Kingdom, centred at Hampi in today's Karnataka. It started small, founded by two breakaway generals of the Bahmani kingdom, but ended up holding sway for 300 years. These powers clashed over control of the spice trade and the fertile region between the Tungabhadra and the Krishna river basins. Tales of the greatest of the Vijayanagar kings, Krishnadevaraya, and his court jester Tenali Rama have made the magnificence of the Vijayanagar court part of folklore. Today's visitor has to make an effort of the imagination to visualize its former grandeur. Vijayanagar was not a centralized empire. It was made up of small regions like Calicut, Sri Rangapatnam, Bhatkal and Gersopa, and controlled by chiefs called Nayaks. These chiefs had to pay regular cash tribute and maintain a fixed quota of armed forces for the centre. However, they had total control in their own regions. The king ensured his superiority by administering one of his domains personally. He displayed his military might enough to remind the Nayaks to pay their tribute promptly. He wasn't always successful, however. The Thirumalai Nayak Palace at Madurai shows how powerful these chiefs gradually became. When imperial power began to look fragile, every little Nayak tried to be a Raja. The cracks began appearing in the splendour of the empire when the substantial revenue was frittered away. The extravagance is clear from the sheer scale of its monuments. Even the ruins of the elephant stables suggest vast expenditure. Little was invested in essential works like the construction of reservoirs and canals. The system of aqueducts was elaborate but inadequate. The royal tanks were beautiful, but the land still thirsted for water. The temples had their own substantial revenues from royal endowments, but they made no contribution to progress. At the most famous of them, the Hazar Rama temple, the income remained the preserve of the royal family. Eventually, the prolonged conflict among these kingdoms resulted in overall destruction. Not all the king's elephants nor all the king's men could prevent the collapse of Vijayanagar. The Bahmani powers defeated the doomed kingdom in a rare show of unity.
There is a certain irony which hangs over Vijayanagar. The irony lies in the fact that although it is called Vijayanagar, the city of victory, today it commemorates only defeat. It marks the defeat not only of the Vijayanagar Empire, but also of Indian feudalism as a whole to cope with the demands of our changing world.
The seeds of that change were already sown at the height of Vijayanagar power.
The city of Vijayanagara is as large as Rome and very beautiful to the sight. You have a broad and beautiful street full of fine houses, and there you find all sorts of rubies and diamonds and emeralds and pearls. It is the best provided city in the world, and everything abounds. It is so rich and beautiful that you would hardly find anywhere another such.
This impressionable visitor was no accidental tourist. Domingo Pais was a Portuguese ambassador to the court of Krishnadevaraya. He was among the first wave of Europeans lured to India by the scent of spices. The European presence opened a new chapter in India's contacts with the rest of the world. What began as a trade in spices expanded into the colonization of India. But that's another story.